Declan Murray and his closest lieutenants ruled Liverpool's streets with fear, cunning, and a cocaine empire that stretched across Europe. For nearly a decade he was untouchable until a single misstep thousands of miles away in Dubai brought the city's most elusive drug lord crashing down. Liverpool in the late 2000s was a city where opportunity and desperation collided on every corner. The docks that once brought trade and prosperity had long since slowed, leaving behind empty warehouses, forgotten streets, and young men searching for fast ways to make money. Among them was Declan Murray, a restless teenager from Toxteth. His childhood had been shaped by a mix of poverty and street survival. By the time he was 16, he was already running errands for local dealers, slipping envelopes of cash into letterboxes, or passing small bags of cannabis in shadowy alleyways. It was dangerous work, but the quick cash gave him a taste of a life he wanted more of. Declan was different from many of the other runners. He wasn't content with small profits or the short bursts of excitement that came with petty crime. He had a sharp eye for detail, and he studied every move his bosses made. He noticed how certain dealers avoided police attention by keeping layers of people between themselves and the drugs. He saw how money was cleaned through pubs, corner shops, and even car washes. Most importantly, he paid attention to mistakes. Whenever a shipment was intercepted or a rival gang was arrested, he made mental notes about what not to do. By his early 20s, Declan had outgrown his role as a street hustler. He began building small crews of his own, recruiting friends who owed him loyalty and younger runners willing to take risks. His first step into independence came when he started buying cannabis in bulk from a contact in Birmingham and selling it across Liverpool. The profits were modest compared to what he would later earn, but they were steady, and they allowed him to reinvest. He bought cheap cars under false names, rented storage units, and set up mobile phones that could be discarded at a moment's notice. Every move was calculated, every expense recorded in his own coded system. As his network grew, so did his reputation. He wasn't the kind of gangster who shouted or made a scene. Instead, he carried himself with calm confidence. People trusted him because he always paid on time and always delivered what he promised. This reliability made him stand out in a world filled with reckless dealers and short-lived ventures. Declan also understood the importance of appearances. He kept his clothes clean, avoided flashy jewelry, and never posted pictures of himself online. To outsiders, he looked like a young man just trying to get by. But behind the scenes he was moving thousands of pounds worth of drugs every week. The turning point came when Declan managed to establish a connection with smugglers who were bringing contraband into the UK from Spain. At first, it was counterfeit cigarettes and cheap alcohol, items that could be hidden among legal shipments. But this contact opened his eyes to a much bigger world. Through them, he learned about the routes traffickers used, the bribed customs officers, and the codes used in communication. Declan began to see that his local cannabis trade was only the beginning. If he could position himself in the right place, he could move on to the most profitable and dangerous commodity of all, cocaine. What set Declan apart in these early years was his patience. While other young dealers rushed into risky ventures and ended up in prison or dead, he carefully built foundations. Every decision was made with the future in mind. He was willing to wait, to study, and to strike only when the time was right. By the end of the decade, whispers about him had already begun to circulate across Liverpool. Some saw him as a clever operator destined for greatness. Others feared he was becoming too ambitious for his own good. Declan, however, ignored the chatter. He knew exactly where he was heading, and nothing, not rivals, not the police, not even betrayal, was going to stop him from rising. Declan Murray's life changed the moment he gained access to cocaine. Cannabis and counterfeit goods had kept his operation alive, but cocaine was where real power lay. The margins were extraordinary, and demand seemed endless. What began as a whispered offer from a contact in Spain quickly became the most important move of his career. At first, Declan hesitated. Cocaine was not just another step up, it was a whole different world, controlled by ruthless people who played by rules that ended in blood. But his ambition overpowered his caution. If he wanted to be more than just a local dealer, he needed to take the risk. The introduction was arranged through a smuggler operating between Valencia and Liverpool. Declan flew to Spain under a fake name, keeping his profile low. In a quiet bar far from the tourist streets, he was presented to men who represented Colombian suppliers. They spoke in coded terms, but the message was clear. If Declan could handle distribution on his side, they could provide product at a scale he had never imagined. The first test shipment was small, just a few kilos concealed in crates of oranges, bound for the UK. Declan poured everything he had into making sure it reached Liverpool untouched. When it arrived without a hitch, his confidence soared. Once the connection was proven, the deals grew bolder. Shipments no longer came in small boxes, but in hidden compartments of cars shipped from Belgium or buried inside containers of machinery. Declan's network expanded rapidly as he recruited drivers, warehouse workers, and dock contacts. Each played their part, often without realizing the bigger picture. Some thought they were moving stolen electronics. Others believed they were transporting untaxed cigarettes. Only a trusted few knew the truth, that they were moving cocaine worth millions. Money began pouring in at a rate Declan had never experienced before. He used it to tighten control over his operation. Couriers were paid generously but kept compartmentalized, ensuring that if one was caught, they could not expose the entire chain. Lawyers, accountants, and even nightclub managers were drawn into his orbit, whether knowingly or not. Declan insisted on discipline, punishing carelessness with swift consequences. His empire was not the loud, flashy kind run by gangsters who drove sports cars and posted their wealth online. His was quiet, structured, and built to last. By 2012, Declan was moving hundreds of kilos every year. His name was whispered not only in Liverpool but also in Manchester, Birmingham, and even London. Rival crews who once mocked him as just another street hustler now found themselves buying product from his distributors. His reputation for reliability spread beyond Britain. Spanish traffickers began to trust him with larger loads, and Colombian contacts viewed him as a rising player worth investing in. Declan knew he was on the edge of something enormous, yet success came with shadows. Every shipment carried risk, and every phone call could be monitored. Police were beginning to notice a surge of cocaine on the streets that didn't match the known suppliers. Customs officers intercepted crates from time to time, and though Declan avoided being directly linked, the pattern worried him. Still, the profits were too great to slow down. Each successful delivery made him hungrier, pushing him to refine his methods and expand further. The transformation was complete. Declan was no longer the boy who ran errands for older dealers. He was now the architect of one of the most ambitious cocaine networks Liverpool had ever seen. His vision had become reality, and he believed nothing could bring it down. But in the shadows, investigators were already piecing together fragments of evidence, building a picture of a man who thought he had mastered the game. With cocaine flooding into the city, Declan Murray began shaping himself into more than a drug dealer. He wanted to appear legitimate, respectable, even admired. Money gave him the power to rewrite his image, and he used it carefully. Liverpool's nightlife was the first target. He bought into a string of clubs and bars, places where his product was already flowing freely. On the surface, he was simply a young entrepreneur investing in entertainment, but behind the scenes, those clubs doubled as laboratories of demand. Every weekend, customers unknowingly became test subjects, and Declan's men monitored which batches were strongest, which prices worked best, and which dealers could be trusted with higher volumes. The clubs also provided a steady stream of cash that could be laundered without raising suspicion. Profits from cocaine sold were filtered through bar tills, disguised as drink sales and event revenue. To anyone glancing at the books, it looked like Declan's businesses were thriving because of booming nightlife. The truth was darker. Alcohol was just the cover for a drug empire that stretched across the city. He didn't stop with clubs. Declan began buying into taxi firms and small construction companies. These investments weren't glamorous, but they gave him practical advantages. Taxi drivers became his eyes and ears, transporting couriers without knowing what they carried and reporting on police checkpoints across the city. Construction sites provided warehouses where shipments could be hidden among pallets of cement and steel beams. Everything was part of a carefully designed machine that kept the drugs moving and the money clean. By now, Liverpool's underworld recognized him as a dominant force. Smaller dealers found themselves squeezed out or forced to buy their supply from him. Those who resisted were crushed through intimidation or financial sabotage. A rival dealer in Bootle suddenly saw his suppliers dry up when Declan leaned on contacts abroad. Another in Kensington mysteriously lost 2 couriers to robberies that were no robbery at all. Each downfall was a reminder that Declan controlled more than product. He controlled the flow of opportunity. Yet what made him especially dangerous was his calmness. He didn't throw parties or parade expensive cars through the streets. He lived in a large but modestly presented home, blending in with middle-class respectability. His neighbors thought he was involved in property development, and he never corrected them. The police, for years, had no clear photograph of him tied to criminal activity. While other gangsters drew attention with violence and extravagance, Declan built a shadow empire that thrived on invisibility. Still, beneath the smooth operation, cracks were beginning to form. Cocaine had saturated Liverpool's nightlife so heavily that detectives couldn't ignore it. Arrested street dealers often led back, indirectly, to Declan's distributors. Seizures at the docks suggested a level of organization far greater than what local gangs usually managed. Though Declan remained in the background, the whispers about him were growing louder. Intelligence reports painted him as a key figure, but without direct proof, he remained untouchable. In his own mind, he had outsmarted everyone: rivals, the police, even fate itself. His empire stretched across multiple cities, his businesses shielded him from suspicion, and his wealth multiplied at a rate that seemed unstoppable. To Declan, Liverpool was no longer just home, it was his kingdom, and he ruled it with a quiet iron fist. But kingdoms built on shadows are fragile, and while Declan enjoyed his reign, forces he could not control were already moving against him. Power always carries a price, and for Declan Murray, the cost came in the form of conflict. By 2013, his influence had spread beyond Liverpool. He was supplying rival gangs in Manchester and Birmingham, moving cocaine faster and more efficiently than anyone else. Some crews attempted to bypass him, thinking they could handle shipments themselves or negotiate directly with suppliers in Spain. Declan, however, had built an empire not just on supply, but on fear and control. He tolerated no defiance. The first real challenge came when a small crew in Manchester tried to smuggle a shipment without his approval. It was a bold move, a direct threat to his authority. Declan's reputation had always been quiet but powerful, and now it needed to be enforced. He organized a response that was brutal and precise. Within days, a warehouse where the rival crew stored its shipment mysteriously went up in flames. Hundreds of kilos of cocaine were destroyed, and with it the rival gang's immediate profits. The fire was no accident. It was a clear, deliberate message. Declan didn't stop there. The leader of the Manchester crew was found days later, beaten and left by a canal. It was a warning for anyone thinking of challenging him. Violence had always been part of Liverpool's underworld, but Declan wielded it selectively, like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. Each act of retribution reinforced his control, but it also spread fear. His allies respected him, but the message was unmistakable: betrayal or competition would not be tolerated. The aftermath of the violence also revealed Declan's cunning. While others might have drawn attention through reckless acts, he made sure that no direct evidence tied him to the crimes. Footprints, communications, and associates were carefully managed to leave minimal traces. To law enforcement, these incidents were troubling but frustratingly vague. There was no clear suspect, no smoking gun, only whispers of a man who ruled through intimidation and strategy. Inside his network, the incidents solidified loyalty. Those who had witnessed his ability to strike quickly and without mercy were more willing to follow orders. Couriers doubled their efforts. Warehouse managers tightened security, and suppliers respected the chain of command. Declan had created a culture of fear and efficiency, where mistakes were punished and obedience was rewarded. His empire functioned like a well-oiled machine, and every shipment, every transaction, and every decision reinforced his dominance. Yet even as his authority expanded, the pressure increased. Rivals were not the only threat. Police surveillance was intensifying. Detectives were beginning to notice patterns in the distribution routes, and intelligence reports were flagging Liverpool as a hub for large-scale cocaine importation. Declan understood that he could not allow complacency. Every shipment had to be flawless, every contact scrutinized. The city had become a chessboard, and he was determined to stay several moves ahead. Despite the constant tension, Declan's empire continued to grow. The combination of strategic investment in legitimate businesses, disciplined enforcement, and calculated intimidation made him untouchable for now. Liverpool's streets had learned to respect his name, rivals feared it, and law enforcement was starting to take it seriously. He had transformed from a small-time hustler into a kingpin, and the city's underworld had no choice but to acknowledge his dominance. But with power came exposure, and even the most careful plans can unravel when ambition and fear collide. For years, Declan Murray had operated with near-perfect precision. His network was organized, his shipments meticulous, and his reputation untouchable. He had built his empire on discipline, fear, and careful planning, and he believed that he had accounted for every possible risk. But the digital age was changing everything. Encrypted phones, coded messages, and secretive apps had once made criminals like him nearly invisible. But law enforcement had begun to evolve at an unprecedented pace. Operation Encrochat, a sophisticated European investigation, had cracked what was considered unbreakable. Messages, once thought secure, were now being intercepted, decrypted, and pieced together into a detailed map of criminal activity. Declan had relied heavily on his communications network. Couriers and managers exchanged information about shipments, payments, and security through encrypted messages. He never typed a name or an address directly, believing that coded language would keep him safe. But even the most careful systems have vulnerabilities. Law enforcement analysts, working tirelessly, began to recognize recurring patterns, connections between shipments, and the timing of deliveries. They were building a mosaic of Declan's empire, one piece at a time. The breakthrough came when agents intercepted conversations that described shipments, amounts, and payment routes. Names that had once been anonymous were linked to specific people, places, and events. Weeks of monitoring revealed how Declan coordinated his teams, moved cocaine across borders, and ensured that rival gangs remained under his control. The level of detail was staggering, everything from packaging methods to contingency plans in case of police interference was documented. For the first time, investigators had a clear understanding of the scale of his operation and the role Declan played at its center. Even as the web of evidence grew, Declan remained confident. He trusted in his experience, his careful planning, and the loyalty of his crew. He avoided flashy displays, stayed off social media, and rotated his contacts regularly. To him, he was invisible, but the digital trail he had left behind was stronger than he imagined. Each message, each coordination note, each seemingly innocuous instruction had become a building block for the authorities. His empire, which had thrived in shadows for nearly a decade, was now being illuminated in painstaking detail. Declan's sophistication was impressive. He had developed an intricate system where every courier knew only what was necessary for their role, and every shipment had multiple fail-safes. But no system is perfect. In the end, it was the reliance on technology that would betray him. Investigators could now see patterns of behavior, trace funds across accounts, and connect him to hundreds of kilos of cocaine moving through Europe. Even more damning were the messages that detailed threats and acts of violence toward rivals. The pieces fit together like a puzzle, revealing not just a drug empire, but a man willing to enforce his will through brutality and manipulation. For the authorities, this was a turning point. After years of being a ghost in the city, Declan Murray's shadow was finally exposed. Operation Encrochat had provided the evidence needed to link him directly to crimes that had once seemed untouchable. What he had thought was invisibility, the careful structure, the coded messages, the discipline, was now his undoing. Declan's confidence, built over nearly a decade of planning and control, was about to be shattered by the very technology he had once believed worked in his favor. By 2017, Declan Murray knew the walls were closing in. Whispers of investigations, raids, and intelligence reports had reached him through the network he thought he controlled. He understood the stakes had changed. The empire he had spent nearly a decade building, with carefully orchestrated shipments and meticulously coded communications, was now under serious scrutiny. Even the most loyal lieutenants began acting nervously, and the couriers he once trusted without question were suddenly cautious, anxious, and prone to mistakes. Declan recognized the pattern. Law enforcement was closing in, and he had to vanish before they caught him. His disappearance was methodical. Declan liquidated properties quietly, using offshore accounts and intermediaries to avoid detection. He shut down phone lines, destroyed records, and left nothing behind that could trace him directly. When police raided his Liverpool mansion, they found it stripped bare, as though he had evaporated into thin air. Family members claimed they hadn't seen him for months, and even long-time associates were left guessing about his whereabouts. Rumors began circulating. Some said he had fled to Spain, others whispered about Morocco, but no one knew the truth. Declan had chosen Dubai. It was a city that offered anonymity amidst luxury. Under a false identity, he acquired a high-rise penthouse overlooking the marina, far from the streets that once carried his name and fear. The city's fast-paced lifestyle and international population allowed him to blend in seamlessly. Casinos, upscale restaurants, and private yacht clubs became his new playground. From this vantage point, he continued to oversee parts of his empire remotely, ensuring shipments moved and profits flowed. He trusted his network enough to delegate, but he remained cautious, never taking unnecessary risks. Life in Dubai was a mix of caution and indulgence. Declan had gone from hiding behind warehouses in Liverpool to enjoying a life of privilege and freedom. Yet he never forgot the streets that had made him. His mind was always calculating, assessing threats, and monitoring communications. He knew that the law never sleeps, and that one small mistake could end everything. Yet for 8 years his careful planning worked. Law enforcement struggled to trace him. The false identity, the offshore accounts, and the controlled contacts kept him just out of reach. Even so, living in the shadows took its toll. Paranoia became a constant companion. Declan trusted few and rarely formed attachments, fearing that a single betrayal could undo all his work. The luxury around him was a mask for the constant vigilance he had to maintain. Despite the penthouse views and high-end cars, he was still a fugitive, living with the knowledge that every decision could expose him. Each transaction, each shipment, monitored from afar, carried the weight of risk that could unravel years of careful planning. While Declan thrived in Dubai, investigators in Europe never stopped. They pieced together financial trails, scrutinized offshore accounts, and followed leads that eventually narrowed in on him. Each year, the international law enforcement community grew more sophisticated, and the networks Declan once manipulated became his potential undoing. For the first time in years, the hunter had become aware of the predator's exact location. In the end, Declan's vanishing act proved temporary. He had escaped Liverpool, eluded European authorities, and built a life of luxury in the Middle East. But the reach of modern law enforcement had caught up. His freedom, painstakingly preserved for 8 years, was approaching its limit. The empire he had built from shadows was no longer safe from exposure. The man who had once believed himself untouchable now faced the stark reality that even ghosts can be found. By 2025, Declan Murray's life in Dubai had grown predictable, and that predictability proved to be his undoing. After nearly 8 years in hiding, he had settled into a routine. Meetings with business intermediaries, high-stakes poker games, and yacht parties had become his daily rhythm. His empire continued to operate in the shadows, shipments coordinated through trusted lieutenants in Liverpool and Europe, while he watched from a distance. For years he had believed himself untouchable, convinced that false identities, offshore accounts and cautious operations would keep him one step ahead of the law. But modern law enforcement was relentless and increasingly globalized. British authorities, in partnership with international agencies, had never stopped tracking him. Analysts traced financial flows linked to his past operations, following a trail that, though obscured, ultimately led to Dubai. Small discrepancies in property transactions and offshore accounts allowed investigators to narrow in on a series of penthouses and luxury apartments. It was a painstaking process, but after years of patient surveillance and intelligence gathering, the authorities had finally located the man who had once ruled Liverpool's underworld. The opportunity came when Declan attempted a property deal in the Dubai marina. Large sums of money were transferred through intermediaries, and this particular transaction caught the attention of investigators. The timing, the amounts, and the connections were too significant to ignore. Undercover agents began watching, photographing and documenting every move he made. For the first time in years, the law had him in its sights, and they prepared carefully to ensure his capture without incident. Declan, confident in his routines, did not notice the net closing around him. The arrest was sudden and precise. On a warm evening, as Declan arrived at a luxury marina to do a successful business deal, plainclothes officers converge. Within moments he was surrounded and taken into custody. Years of careful planning, coded communications, and meticulous evasion had come to an abrupt end. He was handcuffed, read his rights and escorted into a vehicle, his mind racing as he processed the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time in nearly a decade, Declan felt the grip of law enforcement tighten. The extradition process that followed was swift but tense. Dubai authorities cooperated closely with British officials, and within weeks, Declan was on a plane bound for the United Kingdom. The transition from the luxury of Dubai to the stark confines of custody in Liverpool was jarring. Reporters speculated on his empire. Rivals wondered about the power vacuum, and law enforcement prepared for the complex legal battle that lay ahead. The man who had once operated in shadows now faced the full glare of public scrutiny. Declan's capture sent shockwaves through Liverpool and beyond. Former allies scrambled to protect themselves, knowing that his arrest could expose their own involvement. Rivals, who had long feared his influence, now saw the streets opening up for new power struggles. The cocaine empire that had once flowed across the city with precision was suddenly fractured. Declan, who had believed himself untouchable, had been brought down not by street violence or a rival gang, but by patient investigation, international cooperation, and the digital footprints he had left behind. In the end, the Dubai trap proved that even the most elusive criminal can be found. Declan Murray's 8-year reign of evasion came to a dramatic conclusion, marking one of the most high-profile captures in British criminal history. The empire he had built, the fear he had cultivated, and the wealth he had amassed were no match for the persistence and reach of modern law enforcement. His freedom, painstakingly preserved for nearly a decade, had finally come to an abrupt and irrevocable end. Declan Murray's return to the United Kingdom was met with a mixture of fascination, fear, and anticipation. News of his arrest in Dubai had already made headlines across Liverpool, Manchester, and London, and the public was eager to learn how the city's most elusive drug lord had been captured. For years he had been a ghost, a shadowy figure whose name inspired both respect and terror. Now sitting in a custody cell, he faced the reality that his carefully constructed empire had crumbled, and the consequences of nearly a decade of criminal activity were about to catch up with him. The courtroom that would determine his fate was packed with observers, journalists, and law enforcement officials. Prosecutors laid out an extraordinary case, detailing nearly 8 years of organized crime, smuggling, and money laundering. Evidence recovered from Operation Encrochat played a central role, providing a digital roadmap of Declan's activities. Messages, shipment records, and financial transactions revealed the scope of his empire, connecting him to hundreds of kilos of cocaine moving across Europe and the UK. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had meticulously built his network, manipulated rivals, and enforced his power with calculated violence. Former allies and associates, many of whom had once feared retaliation for even minor mistakes, were now willing to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Their statements added depth to the prosecution's case, offering first-hand accounts of the discipline, intimidation, and control Declan exercised over his network. They described couriers who risked their lives to move shipments, warehouse managers who operated under strict surveillance, and rival crews who learned the consequences of defiance through carefully orchestrated acts of violence. The courtroom became a stage where the hidden mechanics of an empire were laid bare, showing the human cost behind the profit. Declan, for his part, remained calm throughout the proceedings. Years of operating in secrecy and evading capture had taught him patience, and he listened carefully as evidence was presented. Yet behind the composed exterior, the magnitude of his situation was clear. Every message, every shipment, every decision that had once secured his power now served as proof of criminal activity. The empire he had spent nearly a decade constructing was now the very reason he faced life-changing consequences. When the sentence was finally handed down, it was severe but expected. Declan Murray was convicted of conspiracy to import cocaine, money laundering, and orchestrating acts of violence against rivals. The judge described him as a dangerous and calculating individual whose influence had extended far beyond Liverpool, and whose actions had caused significant harm to communities across the UK. Life imprisonment was the only sentence that reflected the scale and severity of his crimes. The aftermath of the trial sent ripples through Liverpool's underworld. Former allies scrambled to rebuild their lives or protect themselves from exposure. Rivals assessed the shifting landscape, recognizing that the power vacuum left by Declan's fall created opportunities, but also dangers. His once dominant network, carefully maintained for years, was now fragmented, vulnerable, and under scrutiny. Declan Murray's story became a cautionary tale, a vivid reminder that ambition, cunning, and fear may build an empire. But even the most carefully constructed criminal networks are ultimately vulnerable. For nearly a decade, he had ruled from the shadows, untouchable and feared. But in the end, the persistence of law enforcement, the digital footprints he left behind, and the inevitable consequences of his choices brought one of Liverpool's most notorious drug lords to justice. The empire was gone, the streets had changed, and the man who once commanded respect and terror now faced a lifetime behind bars, a symbol of both power and its fragile limits.